Boom. Protozoans. Today, we're learning about all the little squishy, squiggly things that are in the microscope. Not all of them, but at least the unicellular organisms. We're going to learn about the 4 supergroups, talk about characteristics of kingdom Protista, and recognize the representatives of prokaryotes and protists. Fun story. There's no longer a kingdom Protista. Taxonomy killed it. I should have, except named my child Allele. So it's like, not going to name another one Protista. I almost named one. No, one's name was almost Victoria Jean, and then she decided to be a boy. So now, yeah. Well, I guess that's not a decision. I mean, my chromosome did that. I did. That Victoria Jean was going to be such a good name. Instead, his name's Alexander Michael Pantasis, because my wife said, you cannot name him after a biology thing. I was like, fine. We'll name him after Alexander the Great. And then we signed the paperwork, and I was like, and cyclic AMP. Yeah, that's my life. So, what's in the name? Protozoa. The term is derived from the Greek protos, which means first, because they were probably the first eukaryotes. That doesn't matter, though. You didn't need to write down protos means first. I'm sorry I'm going fast, but there's some things that you don't need to know ancient Greek. You don't Not for this one. And here's the deal. Like I said, there's no more kingdom Protista. I'm teaching you this stuff knowing full well that there's this movement going on right now to sort of be like, you know what? They actually go in all these other groups. So I'm giving you this idea, this particular lecture, in order to say there's all these cool unicellular organisms out there. They may not be all lumped together as a group, but they all do have some characteristics, like they prefer moist habitats. Makes sense. You don't have these little cells just sort of flopping around on the sand. They don't crawl along. They need water to move. And they're usually microscopic. They're teeny tiny. There are some unicellular organisms, though, that they're at the bottom of the ocean. Unicellular, about the size of your fist. That blows my mind. It's not even that it's microscopic. It's that it's the size of your freaking fist. It's amazing. So taxonomy's been messing with protists for years. Now you guys all know at this point how I feel about taxonomy, and in case I haven't made it explicitly clear, I hate it with a passion. Taxonomists have argued for decades on where to put these things, when in the end, it doesn't really matter because life is life. But they talked, maybe we'll divide them up by their ecology, maybe by their habitat, maybe by the way they move. Could be anything. So I want to give you a brief breakdown of their argument, because it's fun. First off, they said, let's label these guys by their ecological roles. And we looked at the ecological role when we talked about speciation. You have algae, protozoa, and fungus-like protozoa. The first group are the algae. You guys have heard of algae before, I assume. Algae is this green, gross stuff. This is all protozoa that are photoautotrophic. What does it mean to be a photoautotroph? Yeah, they make their own energy using sunlight. They make their own food. Making energy using sunlight's a weird way of putting it, because I don't want you guys to get confused. Remember, chloroplasts make macromolecules. They don't make energy. We need algae. Algae produces about half of all of the oxygen on the planet. Yes, we are super concerned about the Amazon rainforest burning. That is terrible, and that will, in fact, deplete the amount of oxygen that's present while releasing carbon dioxide. But we're also losing algae at a very quick rate in the oceans, which means that our oxygen levels are going to continue to drop. See, in the oceans, algae serve as the bottom of the food chain. Algae take the sun's energy. They live along the surface. They take the sun's energy. They convert it into sugar. Other organisms take in those plants, break the bonds, and use that energy for their own metabolism. Without these algae, we would have no life in the ocean. This is a plecostomus. Has anybody ever had a plecostomus as a pet? A few of you guys. I cannot get them to survive. I try, and I try. People are like, they're the easiest things in the world. They eat algae that grows in your tank. Nope. Yeah, how'd you kill it? Wow. Wow, it jumped out. Yeah, I actually, they have algae tablets you can feed them. And I would, yeah, you just take a little tab and you drop it in, and it goes over and starts eating it. Mine died every single time I tried to grow one. It died. Stupid fish. Algal blooms have been known to have a huge impact on the climate. So algal blooms are where you're going to have a large growth of algae very, very quickly. Typically, this happens right at the edge of a river where there's fertilizer runoff. So algae grow fast under ideal conditions. Algal blooms also have been known to have an impact on survival in that area. So it's not just producing or removing carbon and oxygen, it's producing toxins that can harm different organisms living there. Bioengineered algae are becoming a major source of biofuels. And this is super interesting. When you think biofuel, what crop do you think of? Corn. Everybody thinks ethanol from corn. The problem with using corn, and trust me, I genetically modified plants for years in order to create new biofuels. The issue with corn and a lot of the other major biofuel crops right now is that it takes an amazing amount of energy to break down the lignin, the cell walls, in the corn in order to extract the sugar you need, in order to process it into ethanol. Algae break down much faster. Yes?
Another problem with ethanol is that in engines themselves, they like to clog up the engines and make them break down a lot easier. So in a way, it could create more problems than the solution. You're going to have to create more replacement parts and stuff like that.
For the current, so the point is that ethanol gums up engines much faster than a conventional fuel does. And part of that is because of the deposits that will build up. So there are a few solutions to it. One, of course, is adding more additives that will break down that gunk. The other is to design new types of engines to process it in a different way, which we're just not willing to do. But you're absolutely right. Ethanol in engines can, at this point, at our current technology level, can lead to major issues. Corn ethanol. We do corn ethanol primarily because we're trying to buy corn. Corn is a major product that our farmers make. But algae is super cheap. You can grow it in the middle of a desert. That sounds weird. How would you grow algae in the middle of the desert? What? It's got a lot of sun. So you have these giant vats with glass over top to keep the water on the inside. And the algae grows. Then you just decant off the algae, pour off the algae, and you're able to break it down much, much easier than with corn. Problem with algae is that they're not monophyletic. Looks like they're kind of broken up into all these different supergroups. They don't all fit into the same clade. That's a big problem for taxonomy. So that's algae. The other type of protist, I kid you not, are termed protozoa, which means first life. Where algae are autotrophic, protozoans are heterotrophic. That means they need to take in organic molecules from the environment. And they are all unicellular. For a protist, if it's smaller than them, they'll eat it. That's the way things work. If it's bigger than them, they'll run away from it, or in some cases, try to mate with it. But typically, if it's smaller than them, they will eat it. Protozoans are also not monophyletic. They place into all of the major supergroups and kingdoms. They're all over the place. And then our final group of protists are the fungus-like protists. They are called such because they look like fungus. They have these long filamentous bodies. They act like a fungus. They directly absorb food from the environment. They don't have phagocytosis or anything like that. They pull it in directly across their cell walls or cell membranes. So they look like a fungus, and they act like a fungus, and they can reproduce like a fungus. They might create spores like fungus do. So it looks like it acts like it reproduces like it, but it's not a true fungus. The deal is all of these traits are examples of convergent evolution. What is convergent evolution? Yeah.
They develop similar traits based on the environment.
Right, these organisms have developed similar traits based on their environment. Organisms that live and need to break down decaying matter may end up with similar structures because that structure is most suited to that environment. Similar to sharks and dolphins look similar in shape because that shape is very good for moving quickly through the water. All right, so that's one way we classify protists, through their ecology. You can see there's a lot of problems with that as far as taxonomy goes. So because there's so much overlap, another group of taxonomists said, you can't do that. You must stop and reevaluate this whole thing. Don't worry, they had a better way of labeling them. They labeled them by habitat. Where were these protists living? So they said, first group, the phytoplankton. If it swims or floats in salt or freshwater, it's a phytoplankton. So if it's in the water column, at the top or even in the middle, it's phytoplankton. These phytoplankton are super, super small. The bigger they are, the heavier they are, and they sink. So in order to stay buoyant, they stay small. Why do they need to live in the water column or up near the top if they're phytoplankton? Sunlight. They need the sunlight in order to produce food. So they live up high in order to get more sun. The farther down you go, the darker it gets, the less sun you get. That is an absolute key to survival. Once you go beyond a certain level, sunlight just doesn't get down to allow phytoplankton to grow, especially in the sea. So you have one layer of organisms that are sort of floating there, surviving off photosynthesis. And then the farther down you go in the water column, the more they rely on respiration. The more they rely on consuming and breaking down other organisms. These can be either like really short chains or linked together cells. They could be colonies, but they're all connected by my favorite, glycocalyx. It's that glue that holds them together. Glycocalyx is going to pop up again and again and again. So you got the phytoplankton that are free floating, free swimming. They live in the water column. The other label is called periphytonic. Periphytonic protozoans cling to substrates. They hold on to rocks. They hold on to the sides of things. They grow off of the substrate. Microalgae, for instance, you may see these growing like on the side, for those of you who have lost your plecostomus. You may see a lot of algae growing on the sides of your fish tank. These microalgae are attached to a substrate, and then they grow to become macroscopic. They are still just groups of unicellular organisms connected together. They can, in fact, have different genes. It's a group of organisms, not one big plant. You may be tempted to look at it and think, well, there's like seagrass or something. But it's really many microorganisms living together, microalgae. And this may blow your mind. But seaweed is a microalgae. It's a lot of people, and taxonomy might consider them a plants, but it's colonies of microorganisms living together. It can be large. This grows along coastlines and typically is very close to the surface. Have you guys ever gone to the beach and run into one of those when it was underwater? Isn't it like the freakiest thing ever? You like freak that, you know, you run into it and you just do this like hop thing as if that would stop a shark. And for me, I tend to like, I figured out, okay, it's just seaweed. And then I pick it up and I throw it at like my sister because that's just what you do, even when you're old. And then your mom yells at you, even when you're old. These microalgae generate a huge amount of carbon. That means they sequester carbon. They take in carbon dioxide and they turn it into sugar. And then other organisms can eat that. But also, vital to the ocean ecosystem are these large periphytonic algae, because that's where baby fish live. They may have their eggs floating around. They may be born somewhere else, but they tend to hide where you've got periphytonic algae, because they can go underneath leaves. They can hide until they're big enough in order to survive on their own. Without these fisheries, baby fish wouldn't do well, which means we would lose all of our fish species, our commercial fish species. We're already losing them, to be honest. Fish are going extinct, at least the ones that we eat. Lots of what? A lot of fish are factory farmed because honestly, we can't find them in the oceans anymore. So that was one way of doing it. We're like, all right. We got rid of this whole ecological label thing. We're going to go with where they live. Do they float or do they stick to stuff? But the problem became some algae begin their life swimming around, and then they land and stick to something. So kind of threw a wrench into that. So taxonomists said, I got another way of labeling them. We're going to label them by motility, how they move. And I guarantee you on the next exam coming up, one of the questions is going to be describe 4 methods of movement of unicellular organisms. One way they could move is called flagellation. They have a flagella, and that allows them to move through the water. Flagella is this long whip-like structure that spins on a rotor. We talked about it when we talked about prokaryotes. They could be used for movement, but these flagella are also used to capture prey. Vorticella, for instance, has this sort of long attachment point. It's grounded using glycocalyx. It's got a opening at the end where it's got a flagella that whips back and forth, sort of smacking prey around, pulling them in. Flagellates are useful on small protists. They're not useful for big ones. Large cells cannot move using flagella. They just don't provide enough motive force. I tend to think of it as like a speedboat motor. You put a speedboat motor on a small boat and it goes fast, right? You put a speedboat motor on a cruise ship, it's not going to go anywhere. So it's only really good for very small organisms. Volvox, like this, these colonial organisms, uses flagella for their reproductive cells, but only the reproductive cells. Do you know of other organisms that use flagella for reproductive cells? Yeah, people do. The flagella should not be confused with cilia. Cilia are similar in structure to flagella, but much smaller. This is a paramecium, and you can see all these little tiny projections sticking out. Those are known as flagella, these hair-like, very small projections. I'm sorry, cilia, yes. They structurally resemble them, but are much smaller. This is probably an image that you've seen before, some similar image. I want to be very clear about this. Remember, when you're looking through a scope, you're not seeing a three-dimensional image. You're seeing like a cross-section. So here we've got cilia on the outside, but don't forget that they are completely covering the cell. It's almost like a peach. If you were to cut it into a thin slice, you'd see peach fuzz along the outside, but not the inner parts. It would look like there's just a tiny bit of peach fuzz. But if you've ever eaten a peach, like your first mouthful is all peach fuzz. It's completely covering the cell, just like peach fuzz completely covers a peach. There's a lot of it there. Now this works for much larger cells, because small, like that fist-sized cell I told you about. Small cells can use one giant flagella and move. But small cells have tons and tons of smaller motors. So where we had a flagella acting as a speedboat motor, it would make a small boat move, but not a cruise ship. Here we have, I don't know, like a fishing boat motor. But instead of having just one, we've got thousands upon thousands of them placed all over the cruise ship. Now the cruise ship will move. That gives this cell a huge motive force. It makes them extremely maneuverable because you've got the cilia all over. It also makes them extremely fast. Cilia, just like flagella, can also be used to pull food into what's known as a gullet. If you take a look at this organism, Spirostonum, you've got one end where there's a definite mouth, for lack of a better word. It's an opening. Cilia line this, pushing water in this direction, which would pull microorganisms in. Those are then going to be digested by the lysosome. Another way cells move is through what's known as amoeboid movement. You guys heard of an amoeba before? That's what this guy is. The amoeba is going to extend cytoplasm into lobes and just grow these lobes longer and longer and longer. So actin filaments are moving on the end. There's a push of cytoplasm, and that sort of distorts the cell. Basically, here's what's going on. We have a cell body. It's called a soma. It's going to start to push cytoplasm in one direction. The cell membrane extends out because of all of the actin filaments sort of growing outwards. That cytoplasm slides into that newly formed pseudopod, and then the body moves, and the back of it retracts up. Oh, I love this one. Mucilaginous movement. Some protozoa are going to glide along a protein-carbohydrate slime they secrete to move. All right, think about it this way. You guys know what a slip and slide is? It's like a slip and slide made of mucus. They're sort of putting it out in front. They're putting this mucus out in front of them and sliding along it. It's like blowing your nose in front and just, slipping. So those are the 4 major ways that protists move: flagella, cilia, pseudopods, and mucilaginous. So flagellate, ciliate, amoeboid, and mucilaginous. So taxonomists said, let's label them that way.